We'll hang out for a couple of minutes and see if anybody else comes in before we really get started. Feel free, though, if you have a question that you know you want us to cover, to go ahead and type that in the chat box. Thanks, Anthony. And then that way we can make sure that we get to those. Hi, Haley. I assume we're mainly focusing on Essay 2 tonight. That's my plan. I can kind of give you a rundown of what the purpose of that assignment is, because I think if you understand why we have you do it, it'll make more sense what you're actually doing. Hi, Kristen. So I guess while we wait for folks to come in, because we're about 2 minutes after, so we'll see if anybody else comes in. And while we're waiting and you guys are deciding what questions you have, I'll go ahead and explain Essay 2, why we have you write this essay, and what the purpose of it is. Because I think it's important for you to understand those things in order to write a good paper. So, Essay 2 is our second major essay in the sequence. And the third essay is a position, it's not a position paper, it's a proposal in which you identify and define a problem, and you also propose a solution to that problem. So it is a position paper in a way, because you have to argue your position that there is this problem, and you have to use a lot of research to do that. Not only do you have to use research, more research than you did in Essay 1, but you also have to make sure that you appeal to the right target audience. In the position paper, most of you were just writing a basic position, like marijuana should be decriminalized. That audience is not really specific. For instance, a lot of you identified in the homework that was turned in last night, which I have yet to grade, but in the board, a lot of you identified her target audience as everybody in the United States. That's not quite true for a print publication like Women's Quarterly, because I don't know about you, but I don't subscribe to Women's Quarterly, although I probably should. So I'm not part of her target audience. You probably aren't either. None of us were in 2006. So Essay 2 is meant for us to really get in that mindset of a writer and think about specific audiences and how best to approach them. Someone in one of the sections made a statement in the board, I think yesterday or this morning, that they didn't really consider a reporter to be an authority on a topic. And while overall a reporter is not going to be as authoritative as, say, a doctor on a medical topic, or as a university professor on a topic in education, if that reporter's area of specialty is whatever they're reporting on, they have a lot of hours of research and self-study on the topic, and they may even have a lower degree, like a bachelor's degree in that area anyway. So they will be an authority for the general public or for the target audience of the publication. We typically don't read, unless we're teachers, we typically don't read material that's written by someone who is less authoritative than we are, right? I mean, most of us wouldn't read a textbook geared toward middle school students in college, for instance, unless we were helping somebody with their homework. And yet, our children, if they were in that class and using that textbook, would see that person as an authority. So if you think about it that way, it might make a little more sense. But back to essay two's purpose. The purpose here is for you to dissect an article and an argument so you can see its working parts. So let me establish a few things. If you meet the criteria for the source, which is the source should have an author, should be 5 years old or newer, should be from a print publication, and the author has to take a side in a debated topic or issue. I'm going to say issue here. So if you have an article that meets that criteria, if it's really published in a real publication, not just out there on the internet somewhere, and this is why I require a print publication, chances are the editor and the audience think that that person is authoritative enough to write the article and that the article is good. One of the common errors with this assignment is students think that they're supposed to refute the argument in the article they pick. That's not what this assignment is for. Nor are we to assume that the article is poorly written. If it was poorly written for the target audience and for the purpose, it wouldn't have been published. Print publications like any scholarly journal, for instance, or even something as non-scholarly and popular as Time or Newsweek, they have a limited amount of space of what they can print. So they edit and they review everything that comes in. So if a submission doesn't fit their audience and it doesn't fit their needs, they're not going to print it. So we should all assume, if we're meeting the article criteria, that the essay is successful in how the writer chooses to appeal to that target audience. Does that make sense? Now notice that I indicate that it's a good piece of writing for its, hang on a second. So it's a good piece of writing for its rhetorical situation. And what I mean by that is if you take something that was written for say Highlights magazine, which is a kids magazine, right? And say that I don't think they would have an article on vaccinations, but for argument's sake, we'll say that they do. Highlights magazine is geared towards kids, and so an article in that publication will have to approach the audience in a certain way. It's going to have to use terminology in a certain way. That same article would not be appropriate for a pediatric scholarly journal because the audience is different, the purpose is different. So hopefully that example kind of gives you something to fall back on. Think about advertising. If Absolute Vodka puts an ad in Rolling Stone, it's probably not going to be the exact same ad that they put in Family Circle. I'm not sure Absolute would advertise in Family Circle, but I think you get my point. That the audience is key, which is why you have to analyze and profile that audience. So Kristen says, if you have a source that's from a magazine, can we assume that it is a print publication, or should we be doing a thorough search of the publication to make sure that it is? You should probably go to that publication's website. If it's only available on the web, it's not a print publication. If you can go to a newsstand and buy it, then it's a print publication. So in my normal sort of hedging answering way, I would really need to know what source you're asking about so I could help you assess what type of source it is. Note that there are websites like Forbes.com that allow users to sign up for an account, and then they basically blog on that site. So it's not a Forbes magazine article, even though there is a Forbes magazine. It's a contributor piece that was not vetted by the editor in any way. So in those situations, I typically tell students to steer clear of those because the internet is open. Um, as you know, I'm sure from searching for different topics, Google takes you to all kinds of publications and all kinds of websites that you wouldn't normally go to on a daily basis because you're not the target audience for those websites. And so the internet is a scary and unsettling place in terms of identifying target audience for a website because of the way search engines work. An algorithm might take you to a magazine that you would never buy on a newsstand. And if you find what's in that magazine offensive, it doesn't make it bad writing because it may just mean that you're not the target audience, which is why I say print publications are the way to go. Does the author of my article have to be for or against the topic? Yes, it has to. Basically, what we're doing in essay two is we're taking someone else's position argument, which is what you just got done writing for essay one. We're going to take someone else's argument and we're going to dissect it. And we're going to analyze why they made the choices that they made. And let me say this too, that the article that you pick, you're going to be better off in this assignment if you pick an article from a publication that you're at least somewhat familiar with or that you're part of the demographic. Like, even if you've never read the publication before, if you look at the audience profile, say in the media kit or by looking at About Us or whatever on the website, if you find that you fall within that demographic, it's going to be much easier for you to read the essay and just get a basic understanding of it. I think the reason that so many people struggled with Nagai's essay for the homework last night was because it's from a scholarly journal. That's not to say that you're not good readers, but you weren't the target audience for that article. So it's harder for you to come to a piece of writing like that and to automatically understand the title is the thesis. The title is the main idea of the piece. It's harder for you to pick out a nuanced scholarly argument just because that's not what you typically read on a daily basis. So, having said that, while scholarly sources are great for research in academia, and this class is an academic class, you might be better off picking something from, say, Time or U.S. News and World Report, or one of the other publications that's in the two handouts that I gave on political biases and agendas of different publications. Just because those are more mass market, they're not specialty scholarly publications. And I think you'll find just the reading experience a lot easier, let alone being able to analyze it. Trudy asks, when we go to the publication information, like the About Us section, do we assume what they say about themselves is true? Saying that the mean age is 50 with educated readers in 100,000 household or 100,000 and up in income households. Yes, you should assume that's true because it would not be in the publication's best interest to fabricate information like that, because the purpose of that information is for advertisers to figure out how to best place ads in that publication. So, for instance, if you're looking at Time or you're looking at the New York Times, for instance, and you're looking at the audience demographic, the purpose of that information being public is so an advertiser can go in and say, okay, the audience of this publication is 50 years and older, and they're upper middle class to like almost out of middle class at that income range. And so the ad needs to target them differently than it would if we were looking at a publication that is mostly high school graduates who make, say, $30,000 a year. Advertisers are going to target those two groups differently. So, yes, I would assume that information is accurate. Kristen, I really need the source information. So, if you could provide that to me, say in the classroom shell, I can help you. I can't really, uh, you know, the example I gave a second ago about Forbes, um, you know, it just depends on the site, it depends on the article. One way to check it would be to go into the library databases and search for the same article because chances are there'll at least be a reference for that article if it was in a print publication, even if we don't have it in full text. So that would be one way to test it. Um, that would be probably the fastest way. Okay, so Anthony's asked a question. Let me type in a couple of answers quickly. To Trudy, and to Kristen. But a lot of times, Kristen, just depending on the article, if it's not one of those user sites where people can just put up whatever they want that and it's not edited, it will typically, if it's on a publication sponsored part of the site where the editor does vet things, it's probably okay. But again, the best answer I can give you is give me the source. Anthony asks um, about ethos, pathos, and logos. I'm going to answer Suzanne's question first because it's directly related to audience, which we were just talking about. So she asks about how she would find the demographic for time. So let me share my screen and we will go on a little tour. So let me make sure everybody can actually see my screen. Can you see the Blackboard page? Okay, good. So we're cooking with gas. I'm going to go to Time's website. Maybe I'm going to go to Time's website. Pay no attention to the dog flapping her ears. All right. So let's go to Time Magazine. I don't want to subscribe. I'm looking for the close button. Why, oh why? Hang on. It's probably because I hit the wrong link. Okay. So I'm on Time Magazine's homepage. If I scroll down to the bottom, get rid of this ad. Actually, let me hit menu. There's too many frames here. Okay, so I've scrolled down to the bottom. If you notice, there's an advertising link. Some sites call this the media kit. Other sites call it um, advertising or advertise with us, that's the kind of link you want to look for. When I click on advertising, I get this page. Look down at the bottom. There's the media kit. And so there's a link for audience. I'm going to click on that. And then it breaks it down even more because they have different editions of the magazine. I'm going to click on US audience and it gives me a profile. It shows me the split between male and female, how many are in their audience. There's over 16 million in the US audience. Median age is 49, so still working adults. Medium household income, $70,682. Most of them have attended graduate school or college. Some of them are in professional and management positions. And the household income of over $100,000 a year is roughly a third of that reading audience. Now, not only do we want to look at that, but we can also Google search for things like what's Time Magazine's target audience. The audience in the media kit, as you notice here, show up in the Google search as the top thing. So there's the link to where we just were. You might also check the two handouts that I gave. I don't remember if Time is on one of them, but we can say if we type into Google, is Time Magazine conservative or liberal? It gives you the political orientation in Google here. It says moderate, so that means that it doesn't necessarily lean one way or the other. By default, you might kind of think of moderate as potentially maybe slightly more liberal. I don't know. I think all of us tend to think in really extreme terms. Like when I hear conservative, I think really, really conservative. When I hear liberal, I tend to think pretty darn liberal. Although I think all of us, depending on where we fall in the liberal conservative group, probably think the other group is more extreme than we are. So I think most of us probably think of ourselves as moderate, even though we may not be. But moderate would mean that they're neither extremely conservative or extremely liberal. That is an educated audience by and large, and it's definitely at least upper middle class. So you probably don't have a lot of manual laborers reading time. You might have some, but that's not their primary target audience. So does that help a little bit, Suzanne? Good. And I'm kind of partial to Google as a search engine because not only because we have Google Fiber where I live, but I also find that it's pretty intuitive and you can type in a really long string of things and you can get some hits that will lead you other places. Research is kind of like a scavenger hunt. So I know in the past a lot of students have really liked using Bing or they liked using Yahoo. And those search engines don't really tend to give you as good results, in part because I mean they have their own agenda. Bing is run by Microsoft, and Yahoo used to give a lot of results from their own user-generated content, and it's a topic search engine rather than a search engine in the way that Google is. So, um, are we feeling pretty good about audience and how to determine who that audience is? Okay. And we feel pretty good about why we have to do that in the paper. um, because an analysis of an article in Time magazine, obviously, that writer is appealing to a different audience than a writer for Fox News, for instance, or for the website, the American Family Association, for instance. It's a very conservative group. The Heritage Foundation is pretty conservative. So they would appeal to different values, really, which appeals to values are often emotional or pathos appeals, which is a great way for me to segue into Anthony's question about how you're going to work in ethos, pathos, and logos into your paper. So if we think about the essay itself, um, one of the advantages of this type of exercise, because it is very much an exercise in a way that the position paper isn't, we're all doing the same thing. We're just doing it to different articles. So there's a very set organizational pattern that you can just plug your information into. We're all going to need an introduction that has context, because context is part of the rhetorical situation. Example: an article on same sex marriage in Time magazine in 1997 is in a very different rhetorical context than an article on same sex marriage in Time magazine in April of 2015. The context in 1997 would have been that no states had passed um, any laws legalizing same-sex marriage, so there would be no actual legal same-sex marriage in the United States when that first article was written. DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, was passed, I think, in 1998, perhaps. So we didn't yet have the Federal Act, which was struck down in the Windsor versus United States in 2014, or maybe, it was 2014, I think. Might have been 2013. I'm losing track. And so that rhetorical context, the article is going to be completely different, because the world was different in 1997 than it is in April of 2015. A week from today, in fact, the Supreme Court will hear arguments in yet another major case, which will probably determine how they will rule on the whole issue, and settle it once and for all. So the context now is over half of the states in the United States have same-sex marriage laws, making it legal, whereas in 1997 there were none. And so the values and the ideas and the political leanings of those two arguments are going to be very different. This is why you have to set up context for when the article you are analyzing was published, because you have to establish what the audience was thinking, what was going on in the world at the time. You can't just start your rhetorical analysis with something general like, I wouldn't really suggest same-sex marriage be a topic because it's kind of played out at this stage. But say, for instance, you wouldn't just say legalizing marijuana has been a topic of debate for decades. That tells me nothing about when the article was published or what was going on. An article on legalizing marijuana in, again, 1997 would be very different from one written now because of rhetorical context. Colorado and Washington had not legalized it in 1997. So you have to set up context. That's the introduction. Context and the thesis. Okay, sorry about that. Lost my connection. So the introduction is going to be the context and the thesis. We'll talk about the thesis. Well, we can talk about it now. Your thesis statement is going to be pretty boring. Specifically, your thesis will be a summary of the strategies that are used in the article that you choose. So, for instance, you might have a thesis that looks like this. So, as I said, the thesis is going to be pretty boring and straightforward. All right, hang on. I think my mic was off. And as I said, the other thing is that um, we're all assuming that the author does. Okay, thanks, Suzanne. Um, boring thesis. We're all going to assume that the author approaches the audience in a good way because the article was picked to be published, and we are going to assume that the strategies that are used are effective. So the thesis in this case is going to be far more sort of informational in terms of summing up what you're analyzing. Does that make sense on the thesis? It's not really about the context. The thesis is not really about the context or the author's view. The thesis merely identifies the criteria that you're analyzing. That's why I say it's going to be pretty boring. And as the instructor and provider of this assignment, I understand that and I completely expect it. But the introduction paragraph does include context and it includes some setup of the topic in a general way. But the thesis itself just identifies what appeals are analyzed in your paper. So after the introduction, you then are going to write a summary paragraph of the argument in the article. So this is going to go back to what we talked about in the diagnostic. Remember, you had to write a summary response. So this is where you're going to really focus on just summarizing the main ideas. So Smith's thesis is that marijuana should be legalized for recreational use in all 50 states, right? That might be the start of the summary paragraph. And then I'm going to give his main reasons why. Smith argues that it would lead to great tax revenue for the United States to help with the budget and the economic crisis. And he also claims that it will ease the burden on the court and prison systems, as well as ensure that the drug available for consumption is pure and safe. So that might be my summary paragraph. Before you can actually analyze how the argument is made, you have to tell me what the argument is. Okay. Kristen asks if you should paraphrase most or all of the summary, or should we avoid that? Let's review for just a second the difference between paraphrase and summary. Um, Paraphrase is when you take a single sentence or a couple of sentences from a source and you change the wording in those specific points to your own. So, say for instance that I'm paraphrasing a source that says something like 5 million of the 15 million readers of Time magazine are in management positions, right? So, if I paraphrase that, I might say a third of all the readers um, of that particular publication hold management positions as their job. So that's paraphrase. Summary means to take an entire article or source and condense it down just to the main ideas. Both paraphrase and summary are your own words, not quotation, but a paraphrase refers to a single point within a larger whole, and a summary is the condensation of the whole thing. So, there are actually two different activities. You probably should not be paraphrasing um, specific sentences in a summary, because if you do that, you're including too many minor details. You bet. And it often is odd to think about paraphrase and summary as different because they are similar in that they use the same words. But with summary, some guidelines to think about include that you're only focusing on main ideas, and that no matter how long the article is, your summary should be no more than 25% of the length of the original. And there's a summary handout, a mini lesson in the handouts and resources board that gives you some tips for how to summarize effectively. For instance, as you read the article, you might write in the margins what each paragraph covers and then go back through and look at those keywords and pick out the main ideas, and then you write them in your own language. So that helps you focus on the whole and on condensing that down rather than focusing on little tiny points or minor details. So we can start a summary workshop in the discussion board. In fact, I will make a note right now to have one of those set up in the discussion board probably on Thursday, although your paper is due Thursday. I'll go ahead and set that up probably tonight so we can start working on that in the board. Um, So, introduction, context, and thesis is what goes there. You also literally want to introduce the article, by the way, in the introduction paragraph. So, you might think of the introduction paragraph as starting with the context, then listing the author and title, and maybe even the publication date of the article, and then give your thesis. The summary paragraph probably won't list the title again because you just did it in the introduction. So you can start it off with the actual position that's argued in the essay. So you might have like Smith argues that marijuana should be completely decriminalized. That would be his thesis. So after that, after the summary, then you want to get into the audience profile because, again, before you can start breaking down how the writer that you're talking about approaches that audience, you have to identify who that audience is. So paragraph 3 will do that. And I often tell students that the best way to approach this is to start paragraph 3 by having a sentence. We'll use Suzanne's publication, like Time Magazine's reading audience in the United States is comprised of roughly 16 million people. And of those 16 million people, most of them are working age adults with an average age of 49. Those adults are also educated, excuse me, and have a healthy salary range of $100,000 or above is the average. And so you just want to get the basics of the audience in there. Time is a moderate publication, which means that it's neither extremely conservative or extremely liberal, so that it's a mixed audience in terms of politics. So that third paragraph, again, we're not talking about exciting stuff, and we're not talking about something that you really have to apply analysis to. If you do your research, you should have the actual profile laid out for you. You just have to write the paragraph. And again, you're going to come back to that audience profile in your analysis paragraphs. And I'm finally getting to Anthony's question. Starting in paragraph 4, you are going to start analyzing ethos in paragraph 4. It's most logical, pun intended, to cover ethos first, logic second, and pathos last. Here's why. Most readers, if the author has credibility for that reader, most readers look at the title and the author first, right? I mean, I've been known to pick up a magazine or a journal, and if I recognize the author's name, I'm far more likely to read that piece of writing than I am if I've never heard of them. So, if you think about the way we consume articles as readers, it makes sense that ethos would come first. So, you want to identify the author's background. This is another place where research will be useful. Research comes in handy for the context. It also comes in handy for the audience identification, as we just saw by workshopping Suzanne's audience profile. It also comes in handy for identifying the background and the biases of the writer. So you might go to that writer's website. You might go to his professional site and find out who he is. What are his biases? If you go to his LinkedIn page, what causes does he support? What does he write about? Does he tend to, as a writer, is he more conservative in his views? Is he more liberal in his views? Go look at some of the other stuff he's written. You don't have to read everything he's ever written, but if you can identify patterns in his point of view, that will tell you something. Back in the diagnostic, for instance, we read a piece by Thomas Olson on the conservative case for same-sex marriage. Olson in 2013, 2014, whenever the Supreme Court looked at the Windsor case, was actually advocating for the repeal of Prop 8 in California. So he's consistently, over the years, held a fairly liberal stance, although you could say it's conservative because conservatives are for limited government. So he's consistently argued for same-sex marriage to be legal. And he's done it from a conservative view, but it's considered a liberal viewpoint because things get really murky. But so you want to do ethos for each. Google search is a great way. Suzanne's asked about researching the author. Google search is great. A lot of writers who write a lot for publications like Time and other places, a lot of them tend to have an established career as a writer, and so you should be able to find information about them. Sometimes you get lucky and the article actually has a link. If you're using the web version, will actually have a link in their name, and it will give you a short biography. Check and see if they have a website. See if they're on LinkedIn or other professional sites, so you can kind of do some background work on them. Think of yourself sort of as a private investigator. You're looking for biases and assumptions that they would hold that might inform their writing. It might provide connections to the target audience. So Google search is good. So I would recommend, as I said before, that you cover the appeals in order of ethos, logos, and pathos, mainly because credibility is hugely important. Oftentimes, as I've seen lately in the controversy about Dr. Oz, have you guys seen that? A bunch of doctors from across the country wrote to his boss at Columbia and said, you should remove him from the faculty because he's quack. And so their whole argument is based on Dr. Oz's credibility, right? And the idea that his audience, which is made up of lay people, not other doctors, but it's housewives and other people at home who want Dr. Oz to tell them how to lose weight or whatever. They put a lot of stock in his credibility as a doctor, and that's why these other doctors are arguing that he should be removed from his faculty post. Um, I personally tend to argue that his role as a talk show host is completely different from his role as a surgeon, which is what he's on the faculty for at Columbia. So I think the letter is a little misguided, but you can see how powerful credibility is. People believe him because he's got doctor in front of his name, right? That's the fear. So ethos first. Logos is things like um, analogies, hard evidence like statistics. It's things that provide logic to the argument. And I should say, Anthony's question, in part, I'm guessing, has to do with terminology too, and I am perfectly fine. I don't tend to use ethos, pathos, and logos when I'm talking to friends or colleagues necessarily, unless we're talking about work. But I might say something about credibility, or I might say something about qualifications or background. Those are more common user-friendly words that mean the same thing. Reputation. So you don't have to use the words ethos, but you do have to cover the concept, if that helps. With logic, you can use logic instead of logos. If you see any fallacies in the argument, um, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad writing, but you want to consider why the author would use that fallacy. For instance, if you have a really conservative viewpoint, like if you're analyzing something on same sex marriage by Rick Santorum, who's very conservative, he constantly makes the slippery slope fallacy when talking about gay marriage. That if gay marriage is legalized, then people will be able to marry their kids, they'll be able to marry their pets, they'll be able to marry multiple people. And so he makes that fallacy over and over again because he knows it's effective for his target audience. They find him credible for whatever reason, and so it works for them. It wouldn't work for me, it may not work for you, but I'm not his target audience either. So if you talk about fallacies, um, that doesn't necessarily mean that the writing is bad, but you want to analyze why those are used. If he's in front of a group of very liberal people, he may not use that fallacy. It just depends on the audience. So logic, look at how they use statistics, look at how they use analogies, how they build their argument. Is it logical? Um, are there fallacies that are used on purpose? Perhaps over emotional or attacks on other people. For instance, if you had a very liberal argument for same sex marriage, maybe they spend way too much time talking about Rick Santorum and his own personal history. That would be an ad hominem attack and a fallacy, but it would probably work for a really liberal audience. So, again, we're not saying the writing is bad because given that it was published, it's probably not. We're just looking at the choices the author makes. So with logos, think about facts, statistics, other sources, like do they quote other authorities? Do they appeal to other sources' credibility, that sort of stuff. And then you'll have a paragraph at the end. I would probably do emotional appeals last, just because those are the cheapest of the appeals, right? I mean, you can't really win an argument just based on emotion alone, which we talked about in class in terms of the difference between an opinion and an actual argument. Um, overblown emotional appeals that override logic and credibility are not going to be successful arguments. And so oftentimes in this assignment, it's really hard for students to pick out emotional appeals because they expect them to be really obvious, and they're not always obvious. I'll give you an example. The Affordable Care Act being called Obamacare, right? That's an emotional appeal, whether you realize it or not, because that's not the name of the act. It isn't Obamacare. The term Obamacare is emotionally charged because it indicates that President Obama is a dictator who unilaterally, by himself, put the Affordable Care Act in place. It also ignores everybody else in Congress who also passed it, debated it, tweaked it, did whatever. It ignores everybody on his staff who worked on it. It also ignores that Mitt Romney passed a very similar Affordable Care Act in his home state before he ran for president. So look for subtle emotional appeals, look for charged language. Things like, I'm trying to think of the Obamacare as the example I use all the time. I'm trying to think of another example. There was the whole death panel controversy, but again, that was related to the Affordable Care Act. But look at the way they use terminology. If they're appealing to someone else's values, values tend to be emotional. Faith is an emotional appeal. Faith is not rational, it's not logical. Therefore, it's an appeal to values or emotions. So look to see where the author is playing on the audience's values and biases, and that's what you want for the pathos area. And it can come down to something as simple as what they choose to call something, like Obamacare. Anthony asks, when we find these appeals, should we be specific about what they are saying to make the appeal? Yes. So, for example, um, I wouldn't in a paper about the affordable, wait, in a paper about an article that argues against the Affordable Care Act that it should be repealed, I wouldn't just say that he appeals to the audience's conservative bias against President Obama. I wouldn't just say that. I would say that, but then I would say when he uses the term Obamacare 16 times in the article, that's an appeal to conservative values because that's not the name of the act. It's definitely meant to. And so then I would explain how my analysis came about. Does that make sense? Oh, good. Thanks. Great. Hang on just a second. Didn't mean to go there. There I am. And you want to quote because it's a lot like, think about when you are dissecting something in biology or if you're doing something in a chemistry lab, right? You don't just write up your lab report and say, I titrated it and it turned blue and so it's this metal, right? You don't just do that. You get far more descriptive about it and you show the pieces of evidence that you found. And that's what you're doing in this analysis. You're taking little bits and pieces and you're directly analyzing. The verb to analyze means to take part of the whole and look at it closely in relation to the whole thing. That's what we're doing. We're looking at different appeals and we're looking at how they work within the entire thing. It's just like taking a toaster apart to see how each separate part works and contributes to the functioning of the toaster. We're looking at the appeals and how they function for the audience within the argument. I just completely forgot what my next point was going to be. Oh, that one of the things that I often see in papers is just citations sort of randomly sprinkled around. So, like, I'm reading a sentence and it sounds like it's in your voice. There's no signal phrasing or no specific idea that lets me know it's a source, and then there's a citation at the end of the sentence. And as I've been returning Essay 1, I still have a couple of those to grade. So if you haven't gotten yours back yet, you'll get it back probably tomorrow before lunch. And then I'll start working on last night's homework. Um, you might see that I suggest that when you just drop in citations, that in order for me to understand what you're citing, I would have to go pull the source up, read it, reread your paper, and then make an educated guess about what you're citing. This is why you have to quote. Um, Paraphrase is great, but it's not the be all end all. Trudy asked a great question about using I. And you won't use first person here because, like, I found this article is a description of your process before you started writing the paper. That doesn't belong in the analysis of the paper itself. So there really should be no I in the paper. There should also be no you. There should be no we, us, none of that stuff. Unless you're directly quoting the writer. And my connection is blippy again, so it's taking a bit for stuff to go through. So bear with me. Okay, Suzanne, you'll want to do the introduction first. And I'm going to say ethos, logos, and pathos sections, just because depending on the article, you may need more than one paragraph to cover all the examples that you want to cover, and then a conclusion. And I think that in the post I made where I gave the rough draft um, sort of grading criteria, I'm pretty sure there's a basic outline in there in the notes. I will be, yes. I should warn everybody that um, you still need to post either um, today or tomorrow. If you attend, even if you attend both sessions, I'm only going to give you participation credit for one of the 2 days. So if you posted in the board today and you want to come by tomorrow as participation, you could do that. Or if you attended tonight and you didn't post today, you're covered for the day. I'm not going to give participation credit for both chats. Um, so yeah. If you do have other questions, you can also post them in the What I Don't Understand um, thread, and just tell me that you want it to be answered during tomorrow night's session, and I can do that as well. Kristen asks if the conclusion is different. Is it different from any other essay? And the answer in a basic way is yes, it's a conclusion that would logically end a rhetorical analysis. So um, it's not going to look like a conclusion for a position paper just because the essay's purpose is different. Instead, it will just sort of sum up the analysis that you just gave. Again, it's not an exciting paper, and it's not really meant to be. It's basically you working through a process on paper and showing me that you can dissect the article and you can identify, you can summarize it well, you can identify the audience, and then you can show me how the author appeals to them. That's and how the article fits in a larger conversation. That larger conversation is the rhetorical situation or context in which it was published. So that's the purpose there. So I'm going to wrap up. Um, do ask questions in the What I Don't Understand. You're more than welcome to drop by tomorrow night as well. And you don't have to stay the entire, if you came tonight, if you just want to drop in at the start, ask a question, and get your answer and go, then that would be perfectly acceptable to me. Since you're already covered, if you want participation credit, you're covered for Tuesday already by attending a chat. So I'm glad it was helpful. And I thank everybody for joining me and putting up with a slightly blippy connection and two rowdy dogs in the background. So thanks, Trudy, Suzanne, Anthony, Kristen, and Haley. I think I got everybody in there. And have a good night. I'll post this shortly. I might edit out a couple of the connection blips. So I'll see you maybe tomorrow night, and if not, I'll see you in the discussion board.